Welcome to episode 311 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Joining me in a moment is Kate Muth, Executive Director at IMAG, and we're going to talk about international stuff. We're going to talk about cross-border mail, what the USPS is doing in this regard. Kate's going to talk a little bit about some recent research released by the USPS Office of Inspector General on the topic as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the legislative changes on the horizon that could impact on international mail, parcels, e-commerce and all of that. So worth listening to all of that. And just a quick comment before we get to Kate. Since we recorded our interview, there's a piece of legislation has been introduced in the US that would end de minimis on Chinese shipments into the USA. Ponder that one, everybody. So let's get into it. Kate Muth, Executive Director at IMAG. Joining me on the line is Kate Muth. Kate is Executive Director at IMAG and our go-to person for everything to do with international mail. Just about. Kate, there's a whole lot of stuff we're going to cover today, but let's start with the US Postal Service's PMG, because he made a public appearance the other day. I make it sound like he's a recluse that's never seen out in public. He made a public appearance. He gave a speech at the National Postal Forum just recently, and look, why don't I hand it over to you? You can tell us a little bit about what's been happening there in the US.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ian. You are correct. The Postmaster General was at, we had our National Postal Forum here in the U.S., which is the big trade show featuring the Postal Service and the mailing and shipping industry. And IMAG often holds its its quarterly member meeting at the NPF, which we did. And we had the Postmaster General came and spoke to IMAG, and this is the first time he has appeared in front of our group. Of course, he had numerous presentations at the NPF because there were other associations there as well. But this was our first chance to have a conversation with him, and he kind of just took it as a question and answer, which was good for us because so much of his attention and focus, of course, has been on the domestic side of the business, given that it's, 98% or something. I guess we understand that he's got to pay attention to that, but we were very glad to have him and to hear directly kind of where he's headed with an international strategy.
Talking about international then, you mentioned that there's been a lot of focus on the domestic side of the US Postal Service business, talking about pension funds and other really interesting things like that. But for the rest of us and the rest of the world, we're always interested to hear what's going on in terms of international, because e-commerce means that we are in a global, interconnected world. So what are some of the things that have come out of these discussions with the PMG or even with the USPS when it comes to how the USPS is traveling in terms of international cross-border mail?
Yeah, so I joke, and there's truth to it, of course, is that the Delivering for America plan, which is the big USPS sort of transformational plan, it doesn't mention international. So we asked, where is the Postal Service headed? Where do we see the strategy? And I think he's acknowledged that, of course, he's kind of had to get the house in order domestically. So he's starting to pay more attention to international. I think there's a couple of things that has got his immediate attention, which is perhaps reorganizing the Postal Service's internal international division, which it's sort of fragmented where different groups report up through different parts of the organization. So you have operations, the kind of business piece of it, and then the policy piece. And so I think maybe he's looking at bringing that more under one umbrella. And I think that's probably a good place to start. But then, of course, in terms especially of outbound, is getting some focus back on how do you win back the business that you lost due to what was sort of this perfect storm of factors. The pandemic, of course, happening at the same time as the move to self-declared rates, which changed the terminal dues formula and raised prices much needed on the inbound side so that they were covering their costs. And, we weren't sort of giving it away to very low rates coming in from China. But that had the effect of also other countries raising the rates on the outbound side. And then, the loss of airlift during the pandemic and some of the tax VAT changes and stricter customs changes going into the EU in particular. So what's the plan to win that back? And I think that's kind of where the focus is. I can't say specifically that we got real specific answers, but he acknowledged like, now I'm starting to take a bite of that apple.
And you mentioned about if you're winning the business back or winning customers back post-pandemic. What do you mean by that? What happened that led to customers moving away from the Postal Service?
Well, in particular, the loss of airlift to some countries forced, again, this was sort of in the heart of the pandemic and into the next year, even into 2021. We'll use Australia as an example. The Postal Service had to suspend service because of there wasn't enough airlift. There weren't enough carriers going there. And as I think most of your listeners know, a good deal of mail, most of it, at least from the United States, moves in the belly of a passenger airline. So when passenger airlines aren't going there, because of course a country like Australia or New Zealand had shutdowns, mail can't go. So companies had to make other arrangements, find providers who were actually going to countries that were maybe on the Postal Service's suspension list, or at least certain services were on the suspension list. And then once you've made those alternative arrangements, how do you win those folks back? And you certainly have to be able to compete on price. And that's one of the tricky parts, is it's a competitive market, and the Postal Service's prices are sometimes priced just that much higher that they may not be able to win some of that back.
Kate, you've just mentioned price, being competitive on price. If you can't be competitive price, is there something else, or are there other options that the Post or any carrier can look at?
Yeah, I think you can kind of group it as three key elements. You need price, you need visibility, and you need service. And in some cases, a customer may be perfectly satisfied with a longer service, with a more economy type service. They don't need it there in 2, 3, 4 days, and you'll pay a lower price for that, or you'll expect a lower price from that. But, visibility is a key part as well. You need to, especially my members, need to be able to have that scan to know that it reached the destination country, and then to know that it was delivered. And service is a key element. And of course, in the international exchange of mail and packages in both the commercial and the postal, primarily in the postal world, you hand it off to the Postal Service, and they're at the mercy of the destination post or provider to deliver it. So it's a little different from the domestic piece, and it's different from the integrators, where it stays in their system the entire way. But, again, that's where those important partnerships and being part of the global postal network is key.
Now, the USPS Office of Inspector General released some work that it had done, or some research, perhaps is a better word than work. I'm sure it was work.
It's a little bit of work, I think, for him, yeah.
Relating to cross-border and where the USPS sits in all of this. Were there any highlights out of that research that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent, it's an excellent paper, and I recommend it. It sort of captured especially this moment that we're talking about in the last few years and the impacts of all these factors that I've already mentioned. I thought one interesting piece was that if you look at the Postal Service's revenue and volume, and on the inbound side, so first of all, just sort of giving us a snapshot of all of that is fascinating, because the Postal Service's international revenue in 2022, fiscal year 22, was only 1.7 billion. That's, at its height, it was about 3 billion 5-6 years ago. So you've seen almost a cutting in half of the revenue, and likewise for the volume, down to 355 million pieces, when it was in 2019, it was close to 1 billion pieces. So you see this real dramatic decline. But what the paper highlighted on the inbound side, which is, coming into the US, is a good portion of that shifted, packages in particular, shifted to the domestic mail stream, to the Postal Service's domestic mail stream, because you have things being injected directly into, direct injection or direct entry, and it goes directly into the domestic mail stream. And we've seen that, of course, in other countries, the direct injection model is growing. So it is a real boon for the domestic services of the Postal Service. It looks like the bottom's fallen out on international inbound, but it's actually obviously not as bad as that. They've first of all, with the change in to self-declared rates, essentially the Postal Service gotten rid of unprofitable inbound mail, right? So things are now priced above costs. They're making money. It's profitable on what's coming in. And then you have some of the commercial entry getting directly entered into the domestic mail stream. And the paper makes note of that. It doesn't share the specific, what they call global direct entry volumes. That's proprietary, but the narrative indicates that this has been a profitable transition.
And where does the US sit these days in terms of being, whether it's a net exporter or a net importer of mail?
Yeah, that was another fascinating little tidbit in the report. Where, of course, as a country, we're still a net importer of products and goods and things coming in. But from just the postal stream, from the mail stream, the paper noted that with these changes, because of the new models and because of the self-declared rates, the United States is a net exporter of mail, so more outbound than inbound. And that was a key rationale for the changing of the terminal dues system back in 2019 when the U.S. threatened to leave the UPU, was to ensure that we weren't, to sort of get rid of the market distortions there. And those of us countries that were net importers, that distortion was particularly acute.
It's a very diplomatic way of putting it, Kate. One of the things that comes up from time to time when we're talking about the e-commerce parcel delivery market, usually we're talking about in a domestic context, but posts often want to avoid the fate of being the carrier of last resort. When it comes to international, what are your observations there? Is there a risk of being a carrier of last resort, or can posts be a carrier of choice?
I think we're kind of at that inflection point around that. Carrier of last resort, I remember the previous director general said, we run the risk of being the network of leftovers. And we see the Postal Service's sort of volume and revenue trends tracking what's going on globally. At the recent UPU meetings, both in May and back in October, there was presentation of sort of international trend data. And I know there's some dispute about whether that fully covered all data of all posts, and there's maybe some holes in the data, but the trend lines were very clear that you can see that the posts have lost a good deal of the cross-border volume and revenue. It has moved to these commercial channels. Some postal operators, of course, still benefit because they have commercial divisions. They have, entire businesses that are commercial. But other posts that don't have that arrangement are seeing this decline in the cross-border. And I think it's got some of them thinking, how do we either recapture that market, or how do we play a little differently in that space? Do we look for commercial alternatives? Do we kind of look to focus on the direct entry piece where we do the last mile and benefit from a greater influx of domestic packages? So even the UPU is looking at that, kind of doing some work around a B2B2C product. The opening up is, while sort of steps are a little bit tentative, you do have a look at some ideas around products and services that would expand that partnership and kind of voluntarily encourage or open up potentially for posts to create these commercial arrangements with other partners.
Okay, we're talking earlier about the change in VAT rules for Europe. Let's talk about what's happening in the US. I understand there's a bit of discussion about de minimis rates. Is rates the right word? Levels? Thresholds?
Yeah.
We go. I got there in the end, everybody. De minimis thresholds for inbound articles in the US. What's happening?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. A lot of sort of chatter and buzz around on Capitol Hill. Certainly, we've seen it with the need to kind of step up the next generation of the STOP Act. That's the first piece. There's some effort. There's been some introduction of bills to kind of tighten up the STOP Act 2.0, maybe get rid of the exemptions that exist for countries. And then in addition, there's some talk around changing the threshold, the de minimis threshold into the United States, which at the moment is $800. There have been some recent hearings. The House, one of the trade subcommittees, this was part of the discussion. Is the threshold too high? It's kind of being positioned as a loophole for to Chinese companies that put U.S. companies at a disadvantage. It's got some bipartisan support. So I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere we see language in a bill that maybe targets the de minimis threshold and reduces it. That is the direction of the rest of the world, it seems. We're quite high. It is a different sort of environment where safety and security has been the primary concern of goods coming into the United States versus that tax collection purpose that maybe other countries have had. So that's something that's really starting to heat up, and I think we'll see a little bit more discussion on that.
And you just mentioned the safety and security aspect of things, and that's, as I recall, was one of the big drivers of earlier legislation, including the Stop Act, was around synthetic drugs and fentanyl and things like that were supposedly coming in via the postal channel. And so tightening up the AED or EAD, depending on how you want to describe it, was going to, hopefully knock some of that out. So what's the latest there?
I think that's one of the things that we sort of hit on is we're moving to the next generation of the Stop Act, and we're not entirely sure how effective the first generation has been. I haven't seen a whole lot of data coming from Customs and Border Protection that indicates because of the Stop Act, we've been able to capture X amount of, fentanyl coming in, or we've thwarted X amount of opioids coming in. There have been some very interesting research and articles done, unfortunately, on the very large fentanyl problem that the United States has, and it's indicated that the vast majority comes through the ports of entry over the Mexican border. But then it does actually now kind of get into the domestic mail stream. So I think that's something that probably needs a closer look, is we're focusing all this attention on tightening up AED for inbound mail, when it seems like the bad guys have already figured out another way to get it in here. And I just note that Senator Rick Scott from Florida also introduced a bill targeting fentanyl coming in through the mail. And his bill would actually require advanced electronic data on letters and flats coming in. So not just on packets or packages that have goods. And I don't think too much fentanyl is coming in from in through a letter. I just think that seems a bit onerous to put advanced electronic data on letter mail. So, but again, it's kind of getting this attention. It's difficult to find bipartisan legislation that a lot of folks can sign on to, and this is one of those issues that does cut across party lines.
This is something that the rest of the postal world has to pay attention to, though, doesn't it, Kate? Because when the Stop Act first came in, even though it had very specific aims, very quickly that became the standard for international mail. So it's kind of interesting that domestic legislation in the US can have such an impact on standards when it comes to international mail, instead of those standards coming through any kind of international body.
It's been difficult too, because I know, we're seeing it on the outbound side going into Europe, which is now the standard is with ICS2 Release 2 is actually higher than what the UPU requirement is. So and the UPU is supposed to be sort of setting the standard for the whole world. And so you have the global postal model that's different from what certain countries are requiring. And that's, of course, causing confusion and making it difficult. So you really want certainly the standard to be where everybody you want it to be the same. But you're right, as each different segment of the world decides we need this and we need that, we're all moving to that higher standard. But one of the things that certainly for our members that we say is you should kind of work to the highest common denominator and just be prepared for, HS codes going around the world. But it's difficult if you're a country that maybe doesn't have all the technological capabilities, or you are, just really new to the e-commerce world. I think that's where the tricky part will be, especially as you said, that one country's standard will now be different from the rest of the world.
And it's not that this is a situation that's unique to the postal world either. When you think about it, remember when GDPR came in, that effectively, even though it's a European legislation, it impacted on the whole world. And the whole world didn't really want to know about it necessarily, but they had to react to it somehow. So it's not this is a situation that's just for the post. It happens in other sectors as well, because we live in such an interconnected world. Kate, before we wrap up, I probably should ask you as well about WILDS, the women in, I'm going to let you...
The Women in Logistics and Delivery Services.
You recently had a bit of a get-together and an awards ceremony. Well, we know about the awards ceremony because we interviewed the award recipient not long ago. What's the latest?
Yeah, so you had that fantastic podcast with Tammy Hull, the Inspector General. We that is kind of our highlight of the year, is that award. And then we decided to throw ourselves a party at the National Postal Forum. But that's one of our big receptions of the year, is at the National Postal Forum. The opening there's an opening reception at the Postal Forum, and then Wilds has a sort of dessert reception, and we had fantastic turnout. We had K&L Gates is a law firm that's active in the postal space. They had a office in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the NPF was being held, and they hosted there. And we had a number of sponsors that are longtime supporters of the Wilds group. And I don't want to name, I'll forget to name somebody, but you can find all of that on the website. And it really is one of the best events of the year in terms of networking and sort of supporting each other. And then we'll move from there to our next upcoming educational event, which not sure exactly what it is, but I know we'll have something on the horizon very soon.
Kate, if people want to find out more about Wilds, or if they want to find out more about IMAG, two very different organizations, I hasten to add, where should they go?
Okay, for Wilds, you want to go to shedelivers.org. And for IMAG, it's imag.world, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and we're happy to hear from folks who might have an interest in learning more.
So I'll stick a link to Kate's profile, her LinkedIn profile, on the postalhub.com, as well as a link to the IMAG and Wilds websites. Kate Muth, Executive Director at IMAG, thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you, Ian.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, Helene Buldeo-Rye returns to talk about urban warehouses and some of the issues that arise from warehouses returning to the middle of our urban centres. Also coming soon, we've got people from Kantar, from Omnic, from OpenPricer and Cardinal, talking about a whole range of topics, everything from parcel lockers through to parcel pricing, route optimization, stuff like that. Don't miss any of these great interviews. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform. I think I said popcast. So what is a popcast? I have no idea. A podcast relating to pop, perhaps. Anyway, subscribe to the Postal Hub podcast on your favourite podcast platform. I can say whatever I want here because I reckon nobody listens to this bit at the end. You hear the music and you switch off. I could be talking about what I had for breakfast. Anyway, subscribe to the podcast, give it a rating, leave a positive review, all great stuff that really helps. Please, I appreciate it greatly every time you leave a review. Subscribe to any one of my numerous email newsletters over at thepostalhub.com. And if you want to email me about anything at all, my email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.